past few years have seen a considerable increase in the popularity of water gardening, due largely to the tremendous media attention now given to gardening in general. The pressure of 21st century life leads people more and more to seek solace in their leisure activities, with gardens of all kinds offering a place to which they can retreat. Watching fish is undoubtedly very relaxing, be it spectacular koi carp such as these, or simply small goldfish. At any reputable water garden centre, you'll see a surprisingly large range of water features, from the small bubbling stone, through more traditional style statues, to modern features such as this. Themed gardens are also growing in popularity. For example, this Japanese-styled garden, where water is a single element of the overall ambience of the design. Running water adds something to any garden, both visually and audibly, and is often incorporated into most water features. Despite this wealth of choice, the most popular water feature remains the garden pond, by some considerable margin. However, long gone are the images of a hole in the ground with a small fountain and a couple of lilies. These days, with the advent of efficient and affordable filtration systems, coupled with the general public's increased level of expectation, the pond can be so much more, becoming a truly eye-catching feature of any garden. Throughout the course of this program, we'll follow a team of experienced pond builders as they convert a plain, disused area of lawn into what you see here. Whilst these people are professionals, for you to recreate the pond they will create requires no previous experience or specialised skills, and is something that can be completed in just a few days. Of course, you may well have your own ideas you wish to incorporate, and maybe parts of this design you'll feel are not for you. Your own individual tastes will do much to dictate the overall look of the pond. As in all things, you tend to get out of something exactly what you put in, and this simple premise can be applied to the building of a garden pond. Whilst cutting corners and doing the job in a slapdash manner will always yield less than satisfactory results, by approaching it thoughtfully and diligently, you will be instantly rewarded with a water feature that will immediately enhance and transform the garden. The very first thing you need to ascertain when undertaking a job such as this is exactly where the pond will be sited. Whilst this may seem something of an obvious statement, there are a number of key elements that must first be considered before you take the project any further. Consider that the primary viewing point of the garden will normally be from an area close to the house, that is, a patio or from an inside window. So the feature will ideally need to be seen from there. Siting your pond directly beneath overhanging trees is not ideal, due to both falling leaves and extended root growth, both now and in the future. Particularly in small gardens and where you want to site the pond close to the house, sewerage may well be an issue. Breaking into the main sewerage outlet from the house presents obvious and immediate problems that you do not wish to encounter. Any garden pond will need an electrical supply close by to power its associated equipment, so this too will need to be carefully thought of. Our pond is sited close to the boundary fence, where it will be sheltered from strong winds, yet will also receive sunshine for a good part of the day. Too much direct sunshine, however, can create problems with excessive algae growth. You can see that there are a number of things that need to be considered before work can begin, and although you may have to slightly rethink your initial plans, the siting of the pond is vital in both the short and long-term success of the project. We would strongly advocate that you make a detailed drawing of your proposed pond in order to give you a better idea in your mind as to how you wish it to look once finished. Of course, you needn't go to the expense of such an in-depth drawing as this, but we would recommend that you make your plans as detailed as possible. When working on a project such as this, preparation is everything. Think carefully, maybe over the course of a few days. Make your plans, then stick to them as closely as possible, referring to them whenever needed. The next step is to mark out the proposed pond, primarily to give you an idea of its dimensions and overall size, which in turn will help you when ordering building materials. Use a piece of rope, old electrical cable or a garden hose to give you a better impression as to the actual shape and size of the pond. The beauty of doing this is that it gives you scope to experiment a little. So often people tend to opt for simple oval designs, when the difference a couple of small indents into the shape make can be tremendous. In nature, and that after all is what we're trying to recreate, ponds or lakes are rarely formal in shape, and nature should be transferred to the artificial garden pond wherever possible. Complicated, intricate shapes, however, create problems with both the initial construction, particularly when laying the liner, and with water flow within the pond, so keep it relatively simple. Stand back and view the site from all around the garden before you make your final decision. Remember that a pond doesn't have to be large to be impressive. Once you're satisfied, clear the area by removing any shrubs that will be an obstruction or will get damaged. Any you wish to keep can be placed into bags and replanted later, but don't forget to keep them well watered, particularly during the summertime. When in the ground, plants are exposed to a great deal of moisture. Take them out, however, and they can soon dry out. Cut back any overhanging branches, particularly those at eye level, that may be a hazard whilst working. Ensure you're not venturing too far from your initial plans, and when you're happy, finalize the shape with line marker or a can of spray paint. The first task that needs to be undertaken is the excavation of a concrete collar that will surround the pond edge, inside which the main body of water will reside. A small trench, the exact shape of the pond, needs to be dug directly outside the marked line, approximately the width and depth of an average spade. The collar is, in effect, a large washer into which the pond will sit. Before beginning work, however, we recommend that you lay some boards down to save the lawn becoming damaged. Such items are cheap to hire, and even in good weather, earth soon turns to mud if it gets trodden into the surrounding area. To have a beautiful new pond surrounded by a ruined lawn seems a little pointless and unnecessary. Now is a good time to use the turf you remove for the collar to patch up any areas of lawn looking a little shabby. The same can be said for topsoil. Always keep some for backfilling around the pond edges or for use in a rockery. You'll be surprised as to how much you'll need. For most people, however, the bulk of the excavated soil will need to be taken away in a skip. We'd advise that you always get a larger skip than you think you'll actually need. Whatever the size of the proposed pond, around 1/3 extra in volume will actually come out of the hole. And it's always better to nearly fill a larger skip than to need two smaller ones. You'll find that the way in which you fill the skip can have a major bearing on just how much you can get into it. For example, place any compressible materials into the skip first, so that the weight of the earth, once added, crushes that material into a smaller surface area. We'd also advocate that you use a reputable skip company, in order to ensure that the waste is disposed of correctly, thereby protecting the environment. Bear in mind also that if you plan to place a skip on the road, you may well need a license from your local council. The law also dictating that such a skip be lit during the hours of darkness. Ensure also that you book the skip well in advance, particularly around holiday times when demand is high. When digging the collar, try to ensure that the inside edge, the side facing the pond, is as flat as possible, in order to create a smooth face on which the liner and its underlay can rest. The collar is primarily installed to stop subsidence when the the weight of the surrounding rocks is placed on the hole, but it also helps to stop any tree roots from penetrating the liner. Whilst the installation of a concrete collar is not an absolute prerequisite, its benefits far outweigh the little extra time it takes to incorporate it into the design, and we would therefore strongly recommend its inclusion. It then has to be levelled. This job is one of the most important of the entire process. There's nothing worse than seeing liner visible along the waterline along one side of the pond. Take your time and ensure that the collar is exactly level. The use of metal stakes is the most efficient way of achieving your goal, in that the concrete can simply be filled to the top of the pre-levelled stakes and therefore be correct. Use a specified point and work your way around half the collar, ensuring a correct level. Then use the same point from which to work the other way around the pond. You can see here that a number of steel reinforcing rods are being placed into the concrete. This is to further strengthen the collar, thereby preventing it from splitting in years to come. Again, these are very cheap items, but are important to the success of the construction. Just be sure that the ends of the rods remain well inside the collar, so as to avoid them puncturing the liner. In our pond, the builders have deliberately left the level of one end of the pond a single course of bricks lower than the rest, to allow for a small pebble beach to be added, something that will become clear later. Once the concrete has been added to the collar, you should ideally leave it for 12 hours to dry before beginning the main excavation. With this amount of concrete, it's perhaps obvious that the use of a cement mixer is a prerequisite. This again is not an expensive item to hire, but one that will save you hours of work over the course of the project. Ensure, however, that you always use a power-breaking RCD whenever working outside with electrical appliances. When doing any heavy manual work such as digging, we'd strongly advocate the use of the correct footwear, particularly when working with spades and shovels. Thin training shoes are not ideal. Rather, choose a pair of boots to protect your feet. You may also want to undertake a few simple stretching exercises, particularly if this is not the sort of work you normally do. Digging puts an undoubted strain on the lower back region, and loosening up before you begin will pay dividends in the long run. If the ground is particularly hard, you may want to spike the area with a garden fork the night before and run a hose pipe over it, in an attempt to loosen the soil a little. Soil varies drastically across the country, with some areas containing a lot of chalk or clay, and others being almost pure topsoil. A bucket of water in which to clean your spade is a useful tip whenever working like this, particularly if the ground contains a lot of clay, as it does here. The depth of the pond needs to be around 75 centimetres to give the fish room in which to shelter, particularly during the colder months of the year. When digging the pond, ensure that the walls are largely smooth, with just a slight inward gradient to prevent any chance of subsidence. It's also far better to take more small shovels of earth rather than fewer large ones. This will place less of a strain on the back, and it's actually quicker to excavate. Once completed, it's very important that you remove any sharp stones that may be sticking out from the inside walls of the pond, so as to prevent the liner being potentially damaged. Once all the earth has been removed, the shelves that will support the plants can be placed into the pond. The easiest, cheapest, and ultimately most effective way to do this is to use lightweight blocks, such as these. They're easy to transport, can be sawn into shape with little difficulty, and provide a firm base on which somebody could stand should they need to get into the pond at a later date, as well as providing further protection against any advancing tree roots. Do check with the supplier, however, that the blocks you choose are suitable for underground use. They can be bedded down well onto a dry mortar mix, being placed on a few random pieces of rock. Consider that the planted baskets will sit on these shelves, so their height needs to be so as the top of the basket remains just below the finished water level of the pond. The area behind the blocks can be backfilled once they've been levelled around the pond. Purely as an aesthetic point, you may also wish to slightly round off the front faces of the blocks to give a more natural looking face to the shelves. This will be hidden inside the liner, and you need not be an expert plasterer to perform the task. Whilst using lightweight blocks and installing shelves in this way is of course optional, the overall sturdiness of the design will be increased. The flat, level surface will also go a long way to making your job easier when it comes to adding the aquatic plants that will grace your pond. Solid foundations will undoubtedly pay dividends in the long run. The next step in the process is undoubtedly one of the most exciting parts of the project, one where you actually feel like you're making progress: the actual laying of the underlay and the liner into the excavated hole. Before this is attempted, however, we'd recommend that you place a layer of soft sand onto the base of the pond area. This is purely to provide further cushioning, as an extra insurance against the tremendous weight of the water that will push against the liner once the pond is full. The liner underlay is not laid directly into the hole, rather it's cut into strips and placed piece by piece around the pond to ensure a tighter fit. Use a hot air gun to both bind the strips together and so the liner doesn't pull the underlay away from the edging when it's laid into the hole. It's perhaps a good idea to refrain from purchasing both the underlay and liner until you've actually dug the hole, and you can then know exactly the actual amount you require, remembering always to leave plenty of excess. A minimum of 2 people can then lay the liner over the hole and let it gently rest into position. Shoes and socks must then be removed for obvious reasons, and the liner gradually moved into place from within the hole. If the water is simply too cold to face and you choose to wear Wellington boots or waders, ensure that there are no stones stuck in the treads before you get in. Once a rough positioning has been made, place a hosepipe in the pond and turn it on. But stay in the hole while it fills. The weight of the water will pull the liner taut, and you can simply encourage it into its final position. Begin in the middle of the pond base and work outwards, smoothing the liner as you go. This is another vital task in the project as a whole, and one that requires your close attention. Pull the liner back to ensure that the underlay is in position and that there are no large stones poking through where they could cause problems. As the water level rises, you'll find that the liner will largely position itself into the excavated hole. Fill up the pond to virtually its full capacity and lay the excess liner around the edge, still leaving plenty of overhang at this point. Once the liner has been laid and the pond is full, you can begin choosing the rocks that will adorn the edges of the pond, experimenting with their position. It can't be stressed highly enough, however, that this can only be done while the pond is full of water when the liner is in place. So many people make the mistake of concreting the pond surroundings before adding the water. This, more often than not, places an incredible stress on the liner, causing it immediately to weaken. The style and size of rocks you choose are largely down to personal preference. However, we'd advocate larger rocks for the perimeter wherever possible to give a more natural appearance and to provide strength against which any backfilling can be placed. It's largely a case of trial and error. Experiment with a few pieces of rock and see what looks good, but try not to be too regimental in your choice. Also, take the time to stand back and look. It's very hard to see how the edging looks from within the pond itself. Once you're happy with your choice, bed the rocks down onto a piece of underlay to protect the liner against the sharp edges of the rock face. To bed the rocks into position, use a mix of 1 part sharp sand, 1 part building sand, and 3 parts cement, with a waterproofing agent added to prevent any chemicals leaching into the water. Once the rocks have been positioned, Smooth the mortar with a small paintbrush to take off any rough edges and also to enhance the overall visual appearance. Ensure that the liner is pulled up well behind the rocks so that the water level can be raised a little to disguise what would otherwise be visible from the front. The area behind the liner can then be backfilled with earth to hold it in position. Here, the pebble beach is approached in the same way, with a number of rocks being concreted along the front edge, behind which the actual pebbles can be placed. The water level within the pond, however, will have to be dropped slightly so that the mortar can be laid. The inclusion of such a feature in the design adds that little extra something to the finished appearance of the pond as the water rises up over the pebbles. Suitable plants can be added to the marginals, and the fish, when added, will enjoy exploring the beach area. Again, ensure that the liner is brought up to the very highest point before it's trimmed and subsequently hidden. The pebble beach also acts as a perfect overflow to the pond, something that will need to be incorporated into any pond. A length of pipe, strategically positioned away from the pond, just level with the water's surface, will allow any excess water to run away. Probably the most important individual feature of the pond from an aesthetic viewpoint is the waterfall. The eye is naturally drawn to the sight of water tumbling over the rocks, and the audible sound does much to enhance the beauty of the feature. Although you can construct a waterfall from individual pieces of rock, there are a number of ready-made features available to purchase. These are relatively easy to install and have been tested to ensure that when operational, they're pleasing to the eye. Whilst some may appear a little false when first purchased, exposure to the elements for a few weeks soon weathers them up, as does the inevitable growth of algae. Installation is very simple. Just connect the flexible hose to the inlet pipe at the back of the waterfall using a Jubilee clip, ensuring a tight fit. Always perform this task before finally placing the waterfall. As with the perimeter rocks, experimentation is the key. Try a number of positions to ensure you're happy before actually placing the unit on its final bed of concrete. First, place a spare piece of underlayer liner beneath the waterfall, and by bringing it up around the sides, you'll ensure that any drips that escape are only able to run back into the pond. As before, stand back and view the pond from a distance to gauge a true representation of how it looks. To further enhance the waterfall, the builders decided to place a few rocks into the pond itself, just below the surface, onto which the water that runs off the waterfall could cascade. This would serve a dual purpose in helping to both enhance the natural look we were trying to obtain, as well as being a place in which the hoses that would hold the various electrical cables could be disguised. The pond will have two pumps, one continually running the filter and one to control the ornamental waterfall. Underwater lights will also be used to enhance the feature during the hours of darkness. The cables are placed in flexible hose to ensure that in the unlikely event that they should ever need attention, the removal of the electrical units can be easily facilitated. The most obvious place to disguise them is around the waterfall area, where rocks can be strategically placed. The front edging of the pond can be decorated in whichever way you choose, either by placing similar rocks to those used along the back edge, or by incorporating some of the many decorative slabs now readily available, either formal or informal. A good garden centre or builder's merchant will have many options from which you can choose. Whatever you choose, however, make sure that they're bedded well down onto the concrete, particularly under the lip of the pond edging, to prevent them falling forwards into the pond. With the greatest will in the world, and taking into account the creative skills of experienced pond builders such as these, a feature such as this is only ever a recreation of nature itself, regardless of how attractive it looks in the garden. In a totally natural environment, a pond of this size would be unable to support a great deal of fish life, due to the fact that the waste excreted by the fish would in fact actually poison them. This is the primary reason as to why a filtration unit such as this is not only recommended, but actually imperative to the success of the project. The water in the pond is continually pumped through the filter 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, whereby bacteria naturally begins to colonize on the media, and a process called the nitrogen cycle takes place. This, in simple terms, is the natural breakdown of debris, so that the water returning to the pond is such that it's capable of supporting fish life. A filtration unit such as this is simple to install and requires very little in terms of maintenance. An ultraviolet sterilizer, or UV as it's commonly known, is an additional feature on this model, and it's used in conjunction with the filter to rid the pond of algae that would otherwise cause green water. Whilst this would in no way harm the fish, it does somewhat hinder your enjoyment of the pond and its inhabitants. The filtration unit is placed into the ground and backfilled with earth. The inlet hose is fed directly by the pump, whilst the outlet connects to the return pipe straight back into the pond itself. This continuous turnover of water not only keeps it clean, but also prevents it from stagnating. It also adds much needed oxygen to the water, something vital to sustaining aquatic life. The return pipe has been laid into place at the back of the pond and will be positioned exactly later. The next step is to completely drain the pond and clean the liner thoroughly with a soft brush and a garden hose. Despite your best efforts to prevent it, it's inevitable that during the concreting process, some will have found its way into the pond. This, of course, needs to be completely removed before the pond is again filled with fresh, clean water. The pump used to circulate water around the pond is very important. It needs to be both reliable in its operation and sufficiently large enough for the system on which it will be placed. If in doubt, refer to the manufacturer's instructions on the suitability of the unit. Choosing a good quality pump will be of undoubted benefit in the long run, giving you, as it will, many years of service, whilst requiring very little in the way of maintenance. The pump should ideally be placed on the pond shelf, at the opposite end to where it will return the water, to ensure good, even circulation. Always leave a sufficient length of hose between the position of the pump and the point at where it exits the pond. As mentioned, we've decided to use 2 pumps on this system, one continually running the filtration unit, and another simply to power the waterfall. This allows the owners of the pond complete control over their system, being able to turn the waterfall on and off as desired. Always ensure that all the cables coming from the pond are suitably covered, both as a safety aspect and to deter such things as foxes and squirrels from causing mischief. Flexible hose that used to pump water through is ideal. The return pipe from the filter chamber can now be connected. Whilst flexible hose is an option, simple domestic waste pipe such as this is just as good. The larger the diameter of pipe, the better, thereby keeping the restriction placed on the returning water to an absolute minimum. Black is by far the most attractive colour, and by cutting it at an angle, the water exits the pipe smoothly as it cascades back into the pond. The gentle splashing of the water adds yet another audible feature within the garden. If you so wish, the pipe can be largely disguised through the addition of various plants, both garden and authentic aquatic varieties. You can then turn your mind to one of the most enjoyable parts of the process, the selection of plants that will become part of your water garden surroundings. Whilst this is, perhaps more than anything, largely down to your own personal preference, there are a few points that you may like to consider. The appearance of any water feature such as this is transformed by the addition of plants, so their selection needs careful consideration. Remember that within a few months, some of the plants will have grown considerably, so there's no need to choose large specimens. Traditional rockery plants such as alpines will always look good in features such as this, as will ground-covering conifers and pines. Maybe add a splash of colour too, by perhaps choosing a variegated or flowering species to further enhance the overall appearance. Do bear in mind, however, that if there's an area of pond difficult to access, as with the area along the back of the fence here, low-maintenance plants would be advisable. You may like to choose one particular plant to which the eye is naturally drawn, perhaps something spectacular, such as an acer, as a feature in itself. A correctly planted pond does much to benefit the feature as a whole, both in the way that it looks and in the way that the natural balance of the system is enhanced. Plants also provide a welcome source of interest and shelter for fish, giving them somewhere to hide from both the sunlight and any potential predators. Many of the same points apply when buying both garden and aquatic plants, in that you must buy those that visually appeal to you and that you think will enhance your own pond. Always inspect any potential purchases and look for lush green growth as a sure sign of good health. Before being placed into the pond, the plants need to be repotted using special aquatic compost into meshed aquatic baskets, such as these, to ensure they grow well. Even though a little damage is inevitable when removing the plant from its original basket, well-rooted examples are always a better choice, provided of course they're not pot-bound. Always avoid any plant that appears to have damage to the leaves caused by such things as slugs or moths. Common sense also dictates that any plant looking less than healthy should obviously be avoided. People often make the mistake of buying a plant that's already in flower rather than one that's just beginning to bud, thereby missing its most attractive time of the year. Take advice from your aquatic retailer as to the suitability of any plants you're interested in, particularly in respect to the size of your system. Take time when repotting your plants to ensure that all the roots are surrounded by the aquatic compost and that they're packed into their containers well. Any excessive hessian can be trimmed off before the basket is placed into the pond itself. Decorative gravel can be placed on top of the compost to complete the job and to help prevent the fish from uprooting the compost. Before placing them into the pond, float the newly planted basket in water to drain off any excess debris. There are 4 or 5 different kinds of plants suitable for use in a pond, each one with very specific uses and requirements. Marginals are perhaps the most popular, being used primarily to provide the pond with additional beauty and colour. Despite their aesthetic appeal, however, they will also attract creatures such as frogs, newts and dragonflies, the flowers providing invaluable nectar to all kinds of flying insects and butterflies. Aquatic plants are readily available from February through to October, with a few of the hardier species available all year round. Water lilies are the showpiece of any pond and are the one plant primarily associated with water gardening. Not only do their striking flowers immediately catch the eye, but the water lily also provides instant shade and habitat for both fish and invertebrates. It's better to purchase winter hardy lilies rather than the tropical varieties that will only survive in a warmer environment. Lower the lily to its required depth over time, always ensuring the foliage can reach the surface. Placing the plant onto another upturned pot will provide a temporary step, one that can be removed as it grows. Introducing lilies into your water garden gradually is vital to their success. The most popular varieties of floating plant, such as water hyacinths, water lettuce and water chestnuts, are only available in the summer and are unfortunately not hardy and will die in the first frost. Such plants provide both an excellent shelter for fish and a great place onto which eggs can be laid. Another group of plants are those that provide oxygen to the pond. These submerged plants not only add this vital ingredient by way of photosynthesis, but also help to absorb excessive nutrients that in turn cause green water and algae growth. They can be planted in the normal way but gradually lowered, as in the case of the water lily. An additional form of water garden plant is the moisture-loving or bog plant that thrives in an environment around the perimeter of a pond. Plants such as these add another dimension to the water garden, and in this pond would be perfectly sited in and around the Pebble Beach area. Once the plants have been added, now's the time to mature the water before the introduction of the fish themselves. This is done through adding natural bacteria to the system. As the water continually passes through the filter, the nitrification process discussed earlier will slowly, yet naturally commence, and the pond will gradually begin to stabilize. Once the filter has become operational and startup has been added, leave the water running continually so that the water can circulate for at least a week before you even consider the introduction of fish. However, refrain from turning on the ultraviolet clarifier at this stage, as this will kill off some of the natural bacteria needed to mature the filter. We'd also advise that you test the water to ensure that all's well before purchasing livestock. Simple, cost-effective kits, purpose-built to perform this task, are readily available from your aquatic retailer. Using the kits is simply a case of adding a few drops of the chemicals provided to a measured amount of pond water. The subsequent colour of the test tube vial indicates the result of the test. There are a number of tests that should ideally be performed regularly, and the pH or hardness of the water is one of the most important. The pH of the majority of tap water lies somewhere between 7 and 8, and any reading in between this would be acceptable. Levels outside of this will require the addition of some form of buffer, but in reality are quite rare. In truth, it is fluctuating parameters that will upset the balance of the pond, whatever they may be. Another important test is that of nitrite, a poisonous chemical that can cause all sorts of problems until the filter has stabilized. High levels of nitrite are caused by phosphates and nutrients found in the natural tap water once the chlorine has dissipated. Fish should not be added until the level of nitrite in the pond is at an acceptably low level and has been for a few days. Should levels be too high, partial water changes should bring the level back down over the course of a few days. For peace of mind, test for all potential problems on a daily basis, particularly at this early stage. Always test the water at roughly around the same time of day to ensure stability in the results. While this may all sound quite complicated and perhaps unnecessary, in reality it's quite simple and well worth the effort, ensuring as it does that the livestock you introduce to the pond are given the best conditions from the outset. Buying fish is probably the most satisfying and exciting part of the entire project, the culmination of all your hard work. There are a number of species available, from simple goldfish to the more colourful shabunkins and golden orf. Koi carp, whilst readily available at many aquatic outlets, are not particularly suitable for a pond such as this, due in part to their tendency to both destroy the plants and outgrow the pond itself. Koi generally produce far more waste than such species as goldfish, and therefore should be avoided at this stage. A good aquatic retailer will have a number of varieties of fish from which you can choose. When selecting, watch any potential purchases for a while and check that they swim freely and evenly, having no visible signs of disease or distress. Once you're happy with your choice, ask the retailer to place the fish in 2 thick bags and, if possible, a box for transportation home. When you arrive, carry the box down to the water's edge and make a final visual check of the fish through the plastic bag. Once you're happy, open the bag to allow fresh air to enter and then float it on the surface of the pond. This is to enable the temperature of the water within the bag to equalize to that of the pond. Ideally, measure the temperature with a thermometer, and when the levels coincide, you can release the fish. Depending on the length of time the fish have been present in the bag, this should take around 20 to 30 minutes. Once you're ready to introduce the fish, lower the bag beneath the surface of the water and allow them to swim into the pond. There should be no need to touch the fish directly. Remove the bag and keep it in a safe place should it ever be required in the future. Having already tested the parameters, you can be sure that the fish are entering water of a sufficient quality in which they have every chance of thriving. Observe them for a while, checking for any obvious signs of distress, for example, jumping or any excessively skittish movements. Refrain from feeding for 24 hours to give them a chance to settle into their new environment, and then begin feeding small amounts, gradually building up over a number of weeks. Whenever you do offer food, make sure it's all eaten within 10 minutes or so, and remove any excess with a net to avoid it decaying into the pond. Maintaining a water garden such as this is not difficult or time-consuming, and can perhaps best be described as little and often. Obvious things, such as keeping on top of plant growth, both those within the pond and around it, are pretty self-explanatory. However, the filter will occasionally need cleaning out, as an excess of debris will accumulate within the unit over time. This is simply a case of removing the media and washing it in a bucket of pond water, thereby expelling the worst of the detritus. Never use any form of soap or detergent when undertaking a task such as this, for obvious reasons. And never use tap water, as the chlorine contained within it can have an adverse effect on the natural bacteria. Slowing of the flow rate through the filter is a clear sign that the unit needs attention, but regular checks should be carried out to ensure that all is well. The ultraviolet clarifier too will need maintaining, according to the manufacturer's instructions. Remove the quartz tube and clean it, and replace the bulb, so as to ensure that you're not plagued with the dreaded green water. Observing the behavior of the fish to ensure that they remain in good health is another vital form of maintenance, one not so obvious to many people. Occasionally, diseases and infections can be brought into the pond, and you may need to add some form of treatment to restore parity to the system. Whilst looking at the various kinds of fish diseases that may afflict the pond is something far beyond the scope of this program, there are a number of proprietary treatments available to deal with the majority of problems. As with most things in life, a water garden will reward you with many years of pleasure and enjoyment if you initially build it correctly and then look after and care for it properly. The fascination of water is enduring, both its sight and sound. And today, with the aid of efficient modern filtration systems, a pond such as this is within the reach of virtually everyone. In time, as the system matures, it literally takes on a life of its own, as a diverse array of creatures make their homes in and around the pond. The purposeful addition of fish adds a further dimension to the water garden, giving the eye another direction in which to look, and even simple goldfish tend to develop individual characteristics. Over the course of this program, we've looked on as a flat piece of garden lawn has been transformed into this beautiful water garden. We hope we've given you the inspiration to want to build a system of your own. Remember that planning is so very important, and we would firmly advocate you spend as much time as possible with a pencil and piece of paper before moving on to a spirit level and spade. We sincerely wish you